glass is always smudged.
I know, I have to, listen, wearing these for the first time, getting used to it.
You're hot. You're hot.
Hello.
This is why we haven't started.
They turned them on. You want me to tell you?
That feedback's more effective at getting your attention than my voice is. Thank you all for being here. Before we start, speaking of feedback, can you find your cell phones and turn them to silent or vibrate or off, please, so they do not disturb tonight's program, which will begin in just a few short seconds. Thank you very much.
Sir.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Mike Bell, the Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum. It's great to see everyone here. I want to thank you all for being here this evening. This evening marks the 79th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe. So, pretty amazing. You know, I'd like to just take a moment and just make some important recognitions for those both here in person and acknowledge those at home. Any World War II veterans, home front workers, or Holocaust survivors in the audience today? Well, let's give them a round of applause anyway. Right? And then per our tradition, any veterans or active duty members of our armed forces from any era, would you please stand or wave to be recognized? Thanks for your service. And you know, the old bumper sticker out there was Army wife, toughest job in the Army. Any family members of veterans or active duty, would you please be recognized as well for your service and enabling what they do. Thank you very much. Now, I'd also, we have some Patriot Circle and Charter members here tonight, and I really want to say, thank you, because your support allows us to bring programs like this to you, but also really to stream it to those watching at home. So, Patriot Circle Charter members, how about if you also be recognized? There we go. So every May we celebrate Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And now during this period, we have an opportunity to reflect and celebrate the important role that Asian Americans played during the war that changed the world and the war that changed America. So tonight we have author Susan Tate Ankeny here to discuss her newest book, American Flygirl. Now in American Flygirl, Susan tells the story of Hazel Ying Lee, a Chinese American woman who became the first Asian American woman to earn a pilot's license, join the WASP, and fly for the U.S. military, despite widespread anti-Asian prejudice and policies. Now, I should note, Hazel's featured here 3 times in the museum. I found out the 3rd one tonight. It's pretty great. But she's featured in Arsenal of Democracy. As you go into the New Liberation, you see the Faces of the Fallen on the right side. Hazel's one of those. And then in our recent World War II Women in Service, she's in the scrapbook in there. So this is going to be a scavenger hunt for you later to find Hazel in all those places. Now, Susan joins us from Oregon, but this is her first time in New Orleans and first time here at the museum. She's a writer, former elementary school educator, and daughter of a World War II bombardier. She's a member of the Oregon chapter of the 8th Air Force Historical Society, and also a member of a French association which finds and memorializes World War II crash sites in France. So pretty cool. Along with American Flygirl, Susan is the author of The Girl in the Bombardier, a true story of resistance and rescue in Nazi-occupied France about her father's experiences. Now, interviewing Susan tonight will be our own Dr. John Curatolo, our Samuel Zamuri Stone Senior Historian at the National World War II Museum. And just to brag a bit about John, John earned his PhD in history from the University of Kansas. He's author of Bigger Bombs for a Brighter Tomorrow and Autumn of Our Discontent, and his book on Army amphibious doctrine in World War II will be out this fall, correct?
Spring.
Oh, in spring.
Spring.
Okay, in spring. John's a former Marine Corps officer and previously taught at Fort Leavenworth at the Command General Staff College and at the prestigious School for Advanced Military Studies. And he's a veteran of multiple military operations, including Provide Hope in Somalia, Iraqi Freedom, and most importantly, he loves airplanes. So he's the perfect interviewer tonight. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. John Curatolo and Susan Tate Ankeny here this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. And I'm going to echo his sentiment about not only my love of aircraft, but today what I found out taking Susan around, her love of props and rivets. And her and I had a wonderful experience on the catwalk looking at the B-17 and the nose compartment where her father manned a Norden bomb site during the war. So we're sharing our love and passion of World War II aviation today. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. And having said that, can you talk about how you launched from the combat of being an elementary school teacher into becoming a writer?
It was a very easy transition, one war to another. I was teaching elementary school and trying to write my father's story. I felt it was really important to tell it. And after he passed away, I realized I was going to have to tell it. There was no one else to do it or the story would be lost. And I was working about 60 hours a week teaching, and I didn't have the time to write. And I quit teaching to write the story. So vastly different in the beginning because I was in the classroom and then I was just home, alone in my pajamas writing all the time. But that took me 8 years. Then I spent 8 years, part of that in France and traveling along his path. I was led by the same resistance members who saved him. And it was, experience of a lifetime. Treated like royalty, and got to stand on the beach where he was rescued in Brittany. And it was actually after that first trip that I knew I had to write the story for a bigger audience because nobody knew about these French people that had saved him. And they would have been killed. Many, many families, even children, were killed for helping American airmen. And they did that for my dad and other Americans. They risked their lives for him. So the girl in the title is Godelieve Van Laer, and I really wrote the book for her to tell her story. No one knew, her children didn't know about it.
Oh my.
So, yeah.
Well, that's what a service you've done, not only to our nation in capturing that, but also for the French people as well.
Thank you.
And that segued into our topic today, correct? This is how you came across Hazel. You want to go into
Yes,
how
well, I love aviation. But that isn't how this story happened. Wendy McCurdy is an editor at Kensington Publishing, and she contacted my agent because she knew she'd read The Girl in the Bombardier. And she had found that there wasn't a book written about Hazel Ying Lee. She was very surprised. And she contacted my agent and asked if I would be willing to write about Hazel in a similar style. My book, The Girl in the Bombardier, reads like fiction. I not invented dialogue, but I lift dialogue out of letters, and so it flows like fiction, like a real story. It's very cinematic, and that's how they wanted this story. So that's how I came upon Hazel. I live in Portland, so I knew she was an aviator during World War II. I knew her name. There's a painting of her at the Portland airport. So, I just knew little pieces, and when they asked me to write about her, they didn't know I was from Portland. Well, my agent should have known I was from Portland, but the editor didn't know that I was from Portland or that Hazel was from Portland. So this became a really personal story about a place I've lived all my life, and in fact, my ancestors were Oregon pioneers, so Portland is really special to me. Did I go off
No, you
the
didn't.
rails there a little bit?
No, that was one. Well, let's transition off of that. Obviously, Hazel is from Portland as well, as you mentioned. Tell us a little bit about Hazel's young life growing up there on the West Coast in Portland, a little bit to kind of frame her upbringing as a Chinese American.
She was born in 1912, and it was a year after the first woman had received a pilot's license. It was still very controversial and not a popular thing for women to be in airplanes. The common belief was that women would go berserk if they were in an airplane, not piloting it, but if they just went up in the air. They were just too tender and insensible to handle such a thing as flight. And so the first woman getting a pilot's license was, pretty groundbreaking. And that's the world of women that Hazel was born into. She lived in Chinatown in Portland with her parents who had immigrated from China and 8 siblings. They were all in a very, very small apartment in Chinatown. And at that time when she was a child, the Chinese Exclusion Act was enforced. I mean, there was harsh discrimination against Chinese and Chinese Americans. And the idea really was to just keep them in Chinatown. Nobody wanted to see them. If they could get a job outside of Chinatown, they had to be in the stock in a back room where no one would see them. But mostly they were kept to Chinatown. They couldn't own a home outside of Chinatown. They couldn't vote. They couldn't sit on a jury. There were all of these laws in place that started in 1882, I believe. So that's the world Hazel came into. She was expected to be invisible. As a woman, she was expected to marry and have children and take care of her aging parents. There were no other options available for her. It was unthinkable. And she would have been shunned. Women were shunned at that time for doing otherwise.
Yeah. And I found it interesting in the readings throughout that she constantly had to disassociate herself from her ethnicity in terms of whether she was Japanese or Korean or Japanese or Chinese. And that I think even you mentioned that some people even wore pins that said, "I'm Chinese."
After Pearl Harbor, it was scary for Chinese people that they might be considered Japanese. And so after Pearl Harbor in Portland, they wore buttons with an American flag on it that said, "I'm Chinese," so that they wouldn't be taken away. I mean, it was really frightening to be in a family in Chinatown and possibly they'd be taken to internment camps. Japanese people were being taken and they were losing their livelihood, their businesses. They were just taken away and put in internment camps. So the Chinese people did try to disassociate from the Japanese. And of course, American people thought they looked exactly the same. They couldn't tell the difference. So it was a really frightening time to be Chinese.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting, too. You talked about, obviously her getting her private pilot license, but she also drove a car, which, again, is something unique for a woman at that time to even be behind the wheel of an automobile and drive that around. And she's going to take it to the next step further to get a private pilot license.
Yes.
But it seems she had a key figure in this journey she has to become an aviator, and a guy by the name of Alan Greenwood. Can you explain a little bit about him and their relationship?
Alan Greenwood was a really special person, and I don't know if Hazel would have been able to do all of the things she did without him, because he was there right at the beginning. He was only a few years older than Hazel. He was a pilot instructor. He was considered one of the best pilot instructors in the country, which is why he ended up, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, leading the Chinese Flying Club in Portland. But he became Hazel's flight instructor. He taught her to fly first. And he didn't have the same attitudes about Chinese Americans. He'd had some students who were boys, not girls. And he thought they made excellent pilots. And he became a very vocal advocate for Chinese Americans all over the country. He was written about in many newspapers when he was leading this Chinese Flying Club. But interestingly, there's very little written about him. It was hard to find much. And just the fact that he believed in Hazel, he thought that Hazel and then her friend Virginia would prove what he believed, that flying was not just brute strength, but there was finesse involved. And he was adamant that women could be just as good at piloting an airplane than men, and that was revolutionary and not a very popular idea. I don't know that anyone else would have taken Hazel on.
Yeah, you think that he's like a fulcrum for her to launch into this whole other world that she would have only been dreamt about by other women at this time. And along those same lines, can you talk about the Chinese Benevolent Society and how that played a role in her expansion and, of course, going overseas eventually?
Well, the Chinese Benevolent Society, and they had them in all of the Chinatowns in the United States, basically took care of the people's needs. I mean, maybe they helped them find a job, maybe they got legal services for them. They spoke, obviously, the Cantonese that everyone spoke, and so they could help the community members in Chinatown. When China was invaded by Japan in 1931, they sent delegates to the United States looking for pilots. They needed airplanes and they needed pilots. And China at that time only had 4 little fledgling air forces spread across the country, so Japan came in and it was pretty easy pickings for them, and China desperately needed help. So they came to these benevolent societies in Chinatowns and asked them to find a pilot. They wanted a top-notch pilot to form a school, which they called Chinese Flying Clubs, and find Asian American men, not women, to train for combat. And that happened right here in the United States. And Hazel and Virginia were the only women. And probably because of Alan Greenwood.
Greenwood, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's take that to its next step when she actually makes it to China to be employed as a combat aviator. And what's the rest of that story?
Yeah, she's trained in combat. She's ready for combat. They all are. 32 went from Portland, 32 flyers that were trained in combat, and 200 from the United States. But this group got there, and they told Hazel and Virginia they wouldn't be able to fly because they were women. They could take some training, they might find a job for them, but they couldn't actually fly an airplane. A woman had never flown an airplane in China. So Hazel, they were so disappointed, and she felt like people had been cheated out of money, the benevolent societies that had paid for her training. And she spent many, many years there trying to fly. She did for a little while fly commercial aircraft, but toward the end of it all, when Japan was just laying waste to China, she was a security guard watching dogfights overhead in the sky. So she never got accepted to fly, but all of them got commissioned as officers in the Chinese Air Force.
And what role did she serve in the Chinese Air Force?
She worked for a long time in the aeronautical library. And then she ended up she was at the gate. She was a security guard. And they desperately needed pilots. Japan was winning. Japan was wiping their cities out. And there she is at the security gate.
Yeah. Talk to us how she makes it from being a librarian or a security guard to the WASPs. How does she make that transition?
Oh, that's a big leap. Okay.
Yes, it is.
She's in Canton when it's bombed on Easter Sunday and barely escapes with her family and her life. And they end up in Hong Kong, and they're war refugees there for almost a year. But while she's there, she finds out about the trading company in New York City where her sister lives, which is helping get supplies to China. So she thinks, okay, 2 things can happen. If I can get out of China, I can work for them and still help China. But also, it was looking like the United States was going to end up in the war. And they needed pilots. The United States didn't have a lot of pilots. So she thought, they'll surely need me. They'll need me as she was an excellent pilot, too, I forgot to mention. She was as good or better than any of them. So she did get back to New York and began working. And of course, she would write letters to the Air Corps, here I am, I'm ready. And they said no, kept denying her. She kept writing letters. And finally they said, well, you could be a nurse or a secretary. She didn't know anything about doing that. She knew how to fly combat. So yeah, Jackie Cochran started training women pilots to alleviate, so men could go over into combat. Men were ferrying, there were all kinds of work they were doing here. And she thought, women can do that. And that will free up these men to go over to Europe or the Pacific, wherever they were needed to fly. That was the idea. And Hazel read about it in a magazine, Saturday Evening Post.
Saturday Evening Post, yeah.
Yeah, and she applied and she was accepted. And so she went to training in Sweetwater, Texas. And at that time, she hadn't flown in 11 years, I think, when she went to Texas. All of that time, she couldn't fly.
Yeah, and if you're not in the cockpit, you tend to get rusty. Your basic skills will erode over time. But at least she had that core knowledge with her when she went to Sweetwater. Can you talk us to a little bit about what were the requirements for these women to become WASP? What was some of the measuring sticks they used to allow women to come in?
To get in, you mean to be accepted
yes,
to
ma'am.
the training
Right.
program? Well, they took the same tests as the cadets. And in the beginning, at Avenger Field, they were in class with the cadets. They were doing everything the Air Force cadets were doing. They were taking classes in the morning, flying in the afternoon, or vice versa. Same classes. So they took the same tests, the same physicals, which got a little confusing for the doctors.
I'm
They
sure.
didn't know how to give a male cadet physical to the women. There were weight restrictions. They had to weigh, I think it was over 100 pounds and under 175, but it depended on their height. So everything was very similar to the male cadets except for size. And they took the same tests. And
I like the story that you articulate in the book where there was one applicant who didn't weigh enough. And so you want to tell us
that
how she...
happened more than once.
Yeah, okay.
This might be the one that ate a lot when she was going to her physical. Is that, or she
No,
went,
I'm thinking about the one who had the BBs.
Oh, the buckshot in
Yeah.
her, whenever they had to be weighed regularly. And the women were working, well, they were all working so hard, and it was so hot in Sweetwater, Texas, that they were losing weight. They were eating a lot, and they were being fed a lot, but they worried about keeping their weight above 100 pounds. And this one gal who was 5 feet, and I think she was about 95 pounds actually when she was accepted, because she told the doctor she'd been on a diet, and he said, "You're overdoing it." So she put, a bandana with buckshot in it every time she went to get weighed, so she would weigh over 100 pounds. Yeah.
I like the innovation there that she has to come over on top on the weight. I thought it was interesting, too, when you talk about the training that these ladies go through there, and they refer to the field after Jackie Cochran, the fact that once the men left, it became solely women on this base, and they called it Cochran's Convent. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like living in the convent, and talk about Dee Dee Deaton and her roles with the young
Poor
aviators?
Dee Dee. Jackie was quite a woman. She was determined, and in the beginning, this program was experimental to train women because she didn't want anyone to know about it until it was successful. And then she hoped to get the women admitted into the military. So she had a big plan, but she figured scandal was going to take it down. That was her biggest problem. So her plan originally was to get the cadets out of Avenger, and she did. They were only there, I think, about 6 months.
The male cadets.
The male cadets, yes. The women were not cadets. They were civilian. And when they left, there were still problems with the instructors. The flight instructors were asking the women out on dates, and that was forbidden. And if the women didn't go out on a date with them, sometimes they wouldn't pass. And if they didn't pass a flight test, they were sent home. And there was no question about it. You couldn't say, well, he asked me out and I refused. Didn't matter. You were sent home. Yeah, there were a lot of problems with the men.
I like there was one instructor you talked to who had a habit of washing ladies out, and they called him Captain Maytag.
Captain Maytag.
And they kept washing girls out. The cyclic rate. I thought that was
I mean, there'd be like 20 women washed out in a week sometimes.
Yeah.
They were just, and in the beginning, the men weren't really thrilled about this anyway. In fact, one of them says, I quote in my book, "I don't know how to teach a woman. I've only taught men." And he thought that was different, that their brains worked differently. And some of the men quit and said, I can't do it. I can't teach a woman. It's skills I don't have.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting, too, when you talk about when they're in training that they had to go to the beauty shop like once a week and get their hair done, their nails done, and they were required to go to church on Sundays as well to be seen as proper women, whatever that term means. But
proper young ladies, yes. No bad language, which they were full of. They had to, these gals were pretty tough. They had to get their hair done once a week on their own dime. They had to pay for that. And it was ruined by the time they got back to Avenger Field in the wind and the heat. They really didn't like that at all. Yeah, they had to go to church. They had to wear gloves. Even the Jewish women had to pick a church. I think there were 12 in Sweetwater. Pick one, Jackie told them, because she wanted them to be accepted in the community. And of course, in the beginning, when the women first showed up, the town of Sweetwater thought, well, they can either be prostitutes or lesbians. Because no other woman, why would a woman want to be on a male airbase? There could be no reason except maybe they're looking for a husband. And so they were worried about their own husbands. And that took a long time to distill that. Eventually, the people of Sweetwater, most of them, grew to really like the girls, but they had to work at that.
Yeah. Yeah, you make the comment in the book that no woman's husband would be safe with the wasps in the area.
Because, the men couldn't be expected to resist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, too, you mentioned when they're going on cross-country flights. Where do these women, what hotels do they go stay in? You know, because where do they, when they're flying, you know, from point A to point B, and they got to stay overnight.
Right.
And there was one incident where all the hotels were full. I'll let you.
The one where they end up in a pretty bad part of
Yeah,
town,
they
in
end
a
up-
little
yeah.
hotel, and there was a bunch of, maybe you'll remember, were they
Yeah.
MPs?
Yeah.
That saw them going to their
And the
room, and they were knocking down the door
Doors.
trying to get the girls to come out. And actually, no, they had to call in the military police.
Because they thought they were.
They
Yep.
thought they were,
Yeah.
loose women. So that was a problem. And that, of course, is why black women were not accepted into
Oh,
the program.
gotcha.
The plan was to accept them. They didn't get that far because of the traveling. And traveling it was just part of the job. They had to ferry planes to some southern places, and the women wouldn't have been allowed to stay in the hotels. So it was
Especially if they were single women, too, you know.
yeah.
Which is another
There was
stigma at
all
the
kinds
time.
of issues, yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Now, it's interesting, too, you talk about a cadet named, or a wasp named Mary Stanford, who spins and she is killed.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the military, or excuse me, how the government handled her death and the expenses therein?
Well, how Jackie Cochran
Yes.
handled it. That was the first death of a wasp. She had a pilot's license, but she'd only been in training 2 weeks, and first, we don't know why she didn't recover from a spin, and both she and her instructor were killed. Didn't even try to come out of it. But Jackie Cochran, again, wanted to save her program, and so she forbid anybody that knew about it to talk about it. So that first death was kept completely secret. And I don't know how they managed that, but I went through every letter, and no one in Avenger Field mentioned it in a letter, but of course they were told not to.
Yeah. And what about the expenses for her funeral? Who paid for those?
Jackie.
Jackie did.
Jackie
the
paid for everything.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And even once the WASP were in full force, if they were to die by firing an aircraft, what coverage did they get from the U.S. government regarding?
They were civilian.
They were civilians.
Nothing. So one thing that the WASPs talked about until they died, their greatest injustice was that a collection would have to be taken. When one of their sister WASPs died in an accident, they had to go around the airbase and take a collection just to get her body home. And that stung really deeply to the women. Jackie paid for it in the beginning, but there were a lot of deaths.
Yeah. And one of the things that resonated with me, you also mentioned that when a woman would indeed pass, that the family were forbidden to put up a gold service star. That
They weren't military.
They weren't military, so
No
they
gold
didn't.
star, no flag, no military funeral, which, was an
Yeah.
issue in many.
Let's take a better turn here.
Yeah.
There's a story there where Hazel falls out of an airplane.
She falls out of an airplane.
You got to tell me about this falling out of an airplane.
When Hazel came to WASP training, she was probably the pilot with the most experience because of everything she'd done in China. And she was out with her instructor, and they went into an inverted, probably a roll, and he looked back and she was gone. She wasn't in the plane anymore. So he comes skidding in and jumps out. Yeah, I've lost my girl. I've lost my girl. And everybody's kind of freaking out, and they can see her parachute, though, in the distance. And to Hazel, it's not really a big deal. She gets dragged. She loses her shoes. She's all scratched up. They go and get her in a Jeep. She was already walking back. She didn't need a Jeep to get her. And she comes back in the back of the Jeep, and she's holding her D-ring because she's going to be the first member of the Caterpillar Club, somebody who's successfully parachuted out of an airplane. And she comes back and she's like, I don't really know what happened. She's like, I thought my seatbelt was on, but her seatbelt wasn't on. And she was pretty sure she was going to get thrown out of the program for that. But I think because of her skills, too, that she brought, they gave her a second chance.
Yeah, I just couldn't imagine if you're an instructor, like, oh my God, she's gone.
She's
now
gone.
what? Yeah.
And he was the nicest man, Lieutenant LaRue. Yeah, I lost my girl.
Let's take another detour here. She's a young woman, and she actually has a love interest. Cliff, would you like to talk a little bit about
I would love to talk about Clifford Louie because he's great. He was a self-actualized man before his time. Most of the men at that time didn't want their women flying, their wives flying once they were married. And most of them actually forbid it. You know, the WASPs, some of them were already married and their husbands were maybe in the war and they found ways to get around it. But their husbands expected them to not fly. Cliff embraced it. He flew, he loved flying, he knew what it meant to Hazel. They met in Portland. He was actually from Seattle and came down to Portland, and he was 18 and she was 19 when they met in Al Greenwood's flying club. And they were in China together, and it was 10 years before they were actually married. But he went on to become a general in the Chinese Air Force. I mean, he was very successful on his own right, but never occurred to him that Hazel shouldn't fly. Hazel wouldn't have not flown, but you know, he was very supportive and unique.
Much like her, very progressive for their time
Yes.
to allow a woman who's that independent, that strong-willed, you know, to pursue her passions.
And not the way they were raised by
No.
their Chinese parents.
No, and you mentioned that, and her mother was very conventional. Her father was very hands-offish, you know, as a young girl as she was growing up. Once she gets winged, she gets sent to the 3rd Ferrying Command there in Michigan. Can you tell us a little about her responsibilities there when she has her wings and is flying?
She was ferrying aircraft. The WASPs and Hazel flew 78 different kinds of aircraft, and sometimes they didn't know what they were flying until the night before. And they listened to each other so they could learn all the little idiosyncrasies of the different planes. She would often get them off the factory or the runways in Niagara where they were made and take them to various points across the country, sometimes to Montana, like the P-63s that were taken up to Russia because we were giving Russia fighter aircraft. She also trained pilots. And she was trained as a fighter pilot herself, and not very many WASPs were. And so she flew what they were called pursuits then, at over 400 miles an hour, which Hazel loved. Some of the women flew bomber aircraft. In fact, a select group of women were given the choice. You can go to bomber school or fighter pursuit training, and of course Hazel chose pursuit training in the fast planes. There were a group of women, Hazel did not do this, who pulled targets. And this, to me, is the most frightening. I still can't get my mind around it, that these women along the coast in their planes would like, it was like a flag, like a nylon.
It was a sock.
Yeah, a sock behind, and men who were learning to shoot would fire at them. And it's amazing. I don't even know how it's possible that a plane was never hit. Women did die in North Carolina in other ways, but not by being hit by men training.
Yes, I'd like to talk to you about that. You mentioned that there was an inordinate amount of mishaps for female aviators at this one particular base in North Carolina. And what did they suspect some of the issues were?
Well, Jackie Cochran actually found sugar in the gas tank of one of the planes that had gone down, and again, didn't tell anyone. At that point, she didn't tell anyone because she didn't want the girls to quit. And they were already threatening to quit about pulling the targets, because they weren't told they were going to pull targets. They were sent there. They showed up, and now you're going to pull targets. And their friend that had died in a fiery crash, they all saw that, and this had happened before the sugar in the gas tank. And they had a friend who, they crashed in like a marsh. They didn't quite make it to the runway, night, and her instructor was thrown from the plane, but she was trapped and actually couldn't get the canopy, thank you, of the plane open, and she was burning, and people couldn't get to her because she was on fire, and she was screaming, we're going down a sad road again. But the sugar in the gas tank happened right after that. So Jackie said, nobody can know that we're being sabotaged or they won't fly.
Yeah.
It was all about Jackie's program being successful.
What's interesting, though, when you talk about these ladies and their aviation skill, they were actually used by Hap Arnold in the training of men. And what I mean by that, when the new B-26 Marauder medium bomber comes out, it has a very high wing loading and it has a very high landing speed, and many men are afraid to fly it because it's considered a very dangerous aircraft. And it had all kinds of names associated with it. And one of the things that Hap Arnold does is he trains a number of WASP aviators to fly it, put it through its paces, and land at a B-26 base, and then have the men see a woman walk out of the B-26. to shame the men that if this little woman, and I'm using the vernacular of the time, can do it, why can't you? He also did the same thing with the B-29 Superfortress, which was problematic when it first came off the production line. There's an old Air Force adage that you never fly the A model of anything. Okay? Well, the B-29 had all kinds of problems, and he did the same thing with that. He had women fly it to shame the men that if she can do it, why can't you? So
And
the
it
WASP said,
worked.
and it worked, and it certainly worked.
One man said to a woman at his graduation that he had always been sick when he was scheduled to fly, I can't remember which one it was.
The B-26?
The B-26. But he saw her land, and all he could see was the top of her curly little head. And after that, he said, if she can do it, I can do it. So.
There's that. But we see in the course of your book, too, that the tide turns with regard to the perception of the WASPs and their usefulness. Can you talk a little bit about why this is going the opposite direction now?
Yeah, and even showing the men up kind of added to that backfiring eventually. But yeah, they were the darlings coming in to save the war in the beginning, early 43, and by 44, the idea was that the war was almost over and men were coming back and they needed their jobs. And they did, Rosie the Riveter was kind of a similar situation. But with the WASPs, it was very vehement. And there were a group of male pilots that wanted them out. They thought they're taking our jobs, and also they need to be home. And this was published in many magazines and newspapers, that the women needed to go home and take care of their men. They were coming home now. Now keep in mind, this is fall of 44. D-Day has just happened in June. The war is not over. But America kind of wanted to paint a picture that it was. Let's get back to normal. And one way to do that is get the women back home, and they're there to emotionally support their husbands who've been in battle when they come back. And they let them go very abruptly. They won. And here Jackie was poised to make them part of the military, and that was going pretty well. And then this group of pilots, and many of them were civilian, kind of roused up this dislike for them.
Yeah.
So the public opinion turned against them very quickly. And by December 20th of 1944, they were disbanded. Sent home. Most of them never flew again.
Yeah, that's the real criminal element
criminal.
of this here. One thing, too, that people don't realize is while these ladies were ferrying aircraft fresh from the factory to staging areas, none of them went overseas. None of them ferried aircraft into a combat zone because they were forbidden to do. They were close in one instance, but that didn't happen. But what you need to realize, too, is these are brand new airplanes, and sometimes they're not made correctly because maybe they weren't quality controlled or they weren't test flown, and now this WASP pilot is flying a P-51 from the factory to a staging base, and maybe a fuel line isn't connected, or maybe a hydraulic line isn't connected. So sometimes these planes were flawed, even though they're factory fresh, but some of them were not tested. And so there was a difference between being a ferry pilot and being a combat pilot. There's two different skill sets, and these ladies took that on as well. And at a time before you had modern meteorology, modern navigation systems, everything's dead reckoning. So these ladies had to get themselves from point A to point B when the weather would turn south, or when they were over some barren part of the Midwest where there's, the maps really don't help you out anymore. But these ladies are doing these missions.
And there were men who wouldn't fly the planes, like the planes that came back from the war that were just
The war-weary ones,
junkers.
yes.
The men said, I'm not flying that, it's too dangerous. So get a WASP, she'll do it.
That's right. And you make that point as we bring planes back from the war that are very war-weary. They have to send them to reclamation centers. We're going to smelt them down. The ladies are stuck flying these jalopies, I'll use that term for aviation, as opposed to the men that are doing it. Yeah. What do you think, having studied this and written on it, what's the lasting legacy of the WASP pilots themselves? How does that move forward?
Well, they really laid the groundwork for women being in the military. I don't think they thought this in December of 1944, but Jackie's program did succeed. It succeeded, but it took years, many years, for women to, I think it was 48 women were admitted to the military, but they didn't fly until 76, 32 years later before women could fly. And they didn't fly combat until 1994, and that was kept a secret.
Yeah.
Because people couldn't, Americans wouldn't want to know about that.
Yeah.
So that's their legacy. They did it. They were there first, and they proved it. women had better safety records than men. I mean, before that, we're going from a time when women couldn't, they'd go berserk if they were in an airplane, to women had better safety records. This is in a course of what, 30, 40 years? The women had better safety records and were more dependable than the men ferrying these aircraft. So,
Yeah. Regarding, we'll switch back to Hazel for a second here, and I'm just going to take a quote from your book, and I'll have you comment on it. As we mentioned before, Hazel gets her driver's license. She gets her pilot's license. In 1931, there were 200 female pilots in the U.S., less than 1%, and she's the first Chinese American to do so. She goes to China, obviously, but she doesn't get to fight. But she flies P-40s, P-51s, P-47s, P-39s, and P-63 King Cobra, which are very high-speed, dangerous aircraft at that time. And what I found interesting in your comment about her, and here I'm going to read it to you. Hazel gambled. She smoked cigars. She spoke loudly in her husky voice and laughed often and at everything. Life amused her. Her friends were both shocked and enthralled by her behavior, but she didn't see herself as a trendsetter.
no. She wasn't trying to be cool. And she was just Hazel. She was just being who she was. And she was authentic before that was the cool thing to be. And I think people were a little bit horrified, but at that time, women just didn't be themselves at all. Find a husband. And Hazel was doing whatever she wanted to do, and she was loud about it, and she didn't hide herself. And I think her friends were inspired by that.
Yeah. And here we are today, inspired by it.
I
I also
am.
like the fact that you mentioned she knew every Chinese restaurant, from one coast to the other, and she would take people there when they would...
She'd take her friends when they were ferrying
One
planes
thing to
and
another.
order in Cantonese, and they'd never had Chinese food. They'd never known a Chinese person before. They had a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, then you mentioned, too, she's in the back room gambling dice with the men and, drinking whiskey straight, and you're like...
Smoking her cigar.
I was like, I want to party with this girl. She sounds just like a lot of fun.
I know.
Sounds
I
like
want her
a
to be
lot
my friend.
That's right. But she reminds me, too, of another aviatrix that many Americans are aware of, Pancho Barnes, who, if you saw the movie The Right Stuff, and she ran the Happy Bottom Riding Club, and she was a pilot. She ran guns. She drank. She gambled. And you see, Hazel's kind of the same mold of these independent women who nobody's going to tell them what to do at a time when women were told what to do. I think it's
It took
fascinating.
a lot of courage.
I think it did. And you had to be, I think she had to know who she was,
And not care. She didn't
And
care
not
what people
care.
thought.
That's right.
I'm going to do it.
Well, I'm going to open the floor for questions, but thank you so much, Sarah. I really enjoyed talking to you today about this.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Susan. We're going to go towards your left in the middle. Winston.
Hello. All right. I have three related questions. Question one, do you know if Hazel Ying Lee has a Congressional Gold Medal? Were you able to contact any member of her family, and are any of her relatives still in the U.S.? And the reason I ask this question is because I brought this up with the CGM committee one time, and they said that only a family member can nominate her for a CGM.
All of the WASPs were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. I wish I could remember the year. I believe it was Barack Obama. There's a picture in my book of him signing it. So yes, Hazel did. She did not have children, but there are family members living in Portland who I contacted. And what was your third question? It was also about family,
Living relatives.
So Hazel did get a Medal of Honor, and she does have family.
In the country, that she still has family here.
Yes, but,
And were you in contact with them?
yes, but interestingly, they knew nothing about her. Because when she died and her brother died a few days after, the family made kind of an agreement. And this wasn't that unusual at the time, but they weren't going to speak of her anymore. And so I talked to her niece, and she just actually read the book last week and told me, thank you, but I didn't know anything about my auntie. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I actually was a little disappointed in the beginning because I wanted all these personal, stories about her, and they didn't have any.
We will go to your left again, about halfway back.
Did you pick the photo for the cover of the book with her smoking a cigarette to tell a lot about her personality?
Pretty much, yeah. That's the first picture I found when I started researching Hazel, and I was just drawn in. I just look at her, you know. There's a story in that picture, and I knew she was brave and proud. She also looks really proud of she's just gotten her pilot's license here, and she's been accepted into the Chinese School of Flying. So that's by far my favorite picture in the book, and I picked it.
Yes. How old was she when she started flying? I'm sure this is all in the book, but just quick overview of it. How old was she when she started flying? How old was she when she passed away? And could you tell us again how you decided to write about her?
Okay, she was 19 when she had her first flight in a biplane and fell in love with flying and decided to get a license. And she found Al Greenwood. So that was when she was 19 years old. And, you know, she had the license within a number of months and was training for the Chinese flying school at 20. So she went to China. She was still only 20 years old. How did I write the book? Was that the question? Or why?
How are you drawn to her, to write about her?
Yeah. How did you decide to write the book?
After my agent called me and asked me if I wanted to, and I immediately got on the internet that night and just started, I was just so inspired. I was excited. I was honored. I was thrilled that somebody was asking me to write about this incredible person, and it just kept unfolding. I'd never even heard of the Chinese Flying Club, and it was in Portland, and that she went to China. I didn't know that. I knew she was a WASP, and there were all these other things, but it was her personality that comes through, and she's written letters, and her friends all wrote about her, so I really did. There's oral interviews. Feel like I got to know her in a very personal way, and that's what I want readers to know in the book, is to know her personally. You know, who was this hero? And I was inspired. I'm still inspired by her.
We didn't talk about how she met her end.
Should we?
I think we should.
Okay.
I think we should.
She was ferrying aircraft from the Niagara factory to Montana, where it would be picked up and taken first to Alaska and then to Russia. So this was part of I always forget the name of the deal, the buy-in, the Lend-Lease between the United States and Russia. We were giving them airplanes. And the weather was horrible, so all of these, I think there were about 100 planes, kept having to stop because of weather. So it took a long time. Some people never got to Montana due to the weather. On Thanksgiving, the weather cleared. And what happened was everybody descended at once because the weather cleared. Get the planes in, get done. Well, it was Thanksgiving, and so the tower wasn't staffed. One pilot had a radio that wasn't working because it was Thanksgiving. He couldn't get it fixed at the last fuel stop because no one was there to fix it. The tower's overwhelmed, and the planes are just everywhere. The tower is trying to give everybody a message, and the radios are garbled, and they're flashing green and red for planes to land. The planes don't know, is that green for me? Is that red for me? And it's a mess. And Hazel's coming in, and she thinks she has a green. She's got a guy right on top of her that doesn't see her plane, and he's the one with the radio not working. So he basically, before they get on the runway, he lands on top of her plane, and their planes explode. He's able to climb out, and Hazel was on fire. A lieutenant actually got a medal for going into the fire, because that didn't always happen with the WASPs. He went into the fire and pulled her out, and she was on fire. Her jacket was on fire, her skin was on fire, and she lived for 3 days. So she died when she was 32.
And again, this is a time when aviation is really in its infancy, and you don't have radar and positive control.
No radar.
And, the towers are flashing lights, but who are you talking to? And you don't have those kinds of electronic aids there. And so a lot of it is catch as catch can in these days. So unfortunately, that's how. And flying a P-63, which was a pretty hot airplane, and a lot of men didn't want to fly it, the P-63s. It's kind of an unconventional design. But here she is, flying it in adverse weather.
There were a lot of women flying that day.
Yes.
I would say about half of the people, and that's why there's so many stories about it, because the women all wrote about it. And when they did the government report, no woman who was a witness was ever consulted or asked what she saw. And several of her friends saw the actual crash, and they were never asked. They were very upset about that. And they eventually got to the bottom of it, and they got all the records, and it's a long story.
Susan, I have a question. She died in 44. Had she lived beyond the war, what would she have done during the Chinese Civil War? There is no wrong answer, and there is no right answer.
I pretty much know what she was going to head to China. She already knew. I mean, they knew the WASPs were going to be disbanded, and they were making plans. And in fact, she was having Cliff help her get jobs for other women. She was going to take other WASPs over there, and they were going to fly the hump, that really dangerous between 500 and 600-mile stretch to get supplies into China. It was the only way at that time to get supplies to China. And not a lot of people survived it. She probably would have been the first woman to fly that route, and instead it went to Nancy Love. But that's what she was going to do, and she was going to take some WASPs with her.
Another question to your left towards the back.
Can you explain the design of her slacks, the purpose of, how ballooned out they were?
I've always wondered when somebody was going to ask me that, and it's you, because I don't know. They're jodhpurs, and that's what they wore in the 30s. Does anybody know the answer to that? Do you?
I think it's a throwback to maybe say cavalry officers, and that's kind of a devil-may-care attitude, and they would wear these as kind of to show an attitude.
So it has nothing to do with aviation.
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I think those be kind of cumbersome in the cockpit, and these cockpits are kind of small.
Because they don't have hardly
there's
any
not
space.
a lot of room. I thought it was funny, too. You mentioned about how some of the women couldn't fit into the cockpits. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, like Madge.
Yeah.
Madge had to fly with it. Madge was tall. I mean, not real tall by today's standards, but she had to have her knees up to her chest to fly. She was basically folded into the plane. I mean, these cockpits, none of them were very big. Either the biplanes or the fighter planes were really small.
And some have to sit on pillows.
Some had to sit on pillows. Some had to use blocks
To reach the rudder
the
pedals.
rudder. Some of them were 5 feet tall. Yeah.
Makes for some interesting stories about seeing these ladies get into these aircraft. And the thing is, too, most people don't realize that during the Second World War, you had, not like Hazel, but many of the WASP were low-time pilots, not hundreds and hundreds of hours, flying high-performance aircraft. And that is a recipe for disaster. The safety rates for the Second World War for the Army Air Corps are atrocious compared to what you see today with military aviation. We give it a lot of serious study, but that's not really as much as a concern during the Second World War, and even less for the ladies.
Right.
They were flying these
There's
aircraft.
one WASP they've still never found, and she was in a
right?
P-51, and they think she went to Santa Monica Bay, but no trace.
Well, and you make the story, too, where she's in the cockpit of a P-47, and the P-47 is a huge fighter aircraft. It's just absolutely, it's kind of like the Harley-Davidson of World War II fighters. It's huge. And she talks about getting into the cockpit and how, she's like, oh my God, how big this thing is. And her little frame is flying, this aircraft that has 2,000 horsepower behind it. And
Alone.
She's alone.
Yeah.
And nobody's really checking her out. Like, her first flight is her
Well, on a
check rate.
fighter aircraft, there weren't 2 seats, so you flew that the first time alone, not with an instructor, 400 miles an hour. I like the story of the woman that missed the airport. The plane was going so fast, she realized, I went past it and had to come around again. And I mean, they're fast planes.
Because in training, they're flying maybe 100, 115, 120 miles an hour. Now they're going 400 miles an hour. And your brain has to stay ahead of the airplane, and it's very easy to get behind the power curve, so to speak, on that.
I want that outfit, by the way. I think that is a great outfit.
Well, I like the fact that she's smoking by the airplane, too. Like, this is before modern safety, and so I'm gonna go ahead and light one up right here. There's a great picture. You can find it online where there's a B-26 bombardier, and he's in the nose of the aircraft, and he's just smoking in the middle of a mission, Again, safety's not a priority, during the Second World War for many of these people who are flying these airplanes.
Always. It's so World War II, to have a cigarette in your
Oh,
hand.
absolutely.
My dad, it was a pipe.
Is that
But
right?
he'd smoke it as soon as they got to the elevation. It was okay. After a frightening battle,
Yeah.
he'd get that pipe as quick as he could.
We have another question to your left that I'll bring you the microphone over to.
Do you have a percentage of flights that didn't make it? Was it the WASP in the ferrying of the aircraft? Was there any information on that?
Well, I know 38 wasps lost their lives, and that's in like a year and a half amount of time. So there were 38 deaths. Hazel's was the last. But no, there were a lot of accidents. And you're talking about just in this country with the wasps flying, right? Yeah.
You'd have to look at each one of their sorties that they flew, what legs they flew, and then divide that by the number of losses. And
I mean, engines would fall off, and sometimes the plane would cartwheel when they landed because something wasn't working right with the landing gear, and women were killed that way.
Another question from Sean here.
I forgot to ask you this before. So what's your next project from here?
Maybe writing about Arthur Chin, who was another World War II aviator in the same program. He's also from Portland. He became known as the first World War II flying ace. He was an incredibly skilled pilot. And his stories of what he did in China, and he was actually trained with the Luftwaffe as well in Germany in the 30s. So, his wife, he was burned beyond recognition. He was shot down 3 times. And one time when he was burned, he was all bandaged, and the Japanese were coming in, and he couldn't move, so his wife took their 2 sons to safety and came back and just put her body on top of his, and she was killed. And and he just went on. He had an extraordinary life story.
Probably the last question from Paula here.
During your research for this book, how many times did you travel to China? And if you did travel to China, how open were they to share their story about her?
I wish I could have traveled to China. My daughter was teaching there in Shanghai, and I wasn't able to go because of the pandemic. We got our passports. You have to have a special visa to go to China, and we got all that, but we weren't able to go. The people there are there are American heroes that helped them. I mean, Arthur Chin is one of them. Hazel is known there as a pilot, and, not the same as the men because she didn't fly in combat, but they have a great respect for the Americans that came over and helped them during the 30s, kind of like France is toward the Americans and the Allies that helped them get their freedom, and they still do, and they have statues, and there's a really incredible flying tigers statue in China, but I didn't get to go to China.
MC's prerogative. Is there any discussion about your book being turned into a series or film? And can you discuss it?
I can. I don't know. I just know it's being read right. Well, actually, it's being read now by 3 film companies, but one of them is 20th Century Fox. So that would be great. Yeah, thank you. I mean, yes. Let's all do this.
That's right.
That'd be great.
Well, until then, we can all enjoy it by reading the book. But John Caratola, Susan Ankeny, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Enjoyed it very much.
John. Thank you.
So a fascinating, inspiring story, and certainly I can see why we may be seeing this on the big screen. Incredible stories there, whether it's service in China or, Lend-Lease aircraft, the 11,000 aircraft we sent to the Soviet Union in World War II. Imagine those numbers, crazy numbers. So, I'd like to thank Susan for being here tonight and sharing that story of Hazel with us, and she'll be signing copies of her book at the table back to your left. Am I right? I would ask folks, mark your calendars for June 6th and 7th. We're commemorating the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy. If you join us for our next educational symposium, it's called Beyond the Beaches, D+1 and the Battle for Normandy. And the program will begin on Thursday evening, June 6th, with an opening keynote lecture by Pulitzer Prize-winning author Rick Atkinson. And we'll continue on Friday, June 7th, with panels throughout the day discussing the intense fighting that really led to the breakout at Normandy, but the larger campaign beyond just D-Day itself. But with that, let's thank John and Susan, and coming out tonight. Let's give them another round of applause.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again for being here. I
The
appreciate it.
table's over here. We'll take you, we'll walk you over
Oh,
there.
okay.
That's too easy.